This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined today by Mark Vernon, scholar, psychotherapist, and author of several books, most recently of A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, the Last Inkling in the Evolution of Consciousness, and just out, Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey. Mark, thanks for agreeing to do this today. It's an incredibly generous use of your time.
No, well, thank you. I very much enjoyed some of your conversations, so it's a delight for me to participate in them too.
The conversation I pitched to you today is on consciousness, specifically as consciousness is understood in and important to the Christian tradition. As a PhD in philosophy with credentials in physics, theology, and an active psychotherapeutic practice, you have quite a bit of great things to say about consciousness generally, in Christian theology and in comparative religious perspective. But I'm first interested in how you got into the topic. Was this the theme you were consciously chasing across your various fields, or did it sort of organically present itself to you?
I certainly had quite a process of chasing, but to cut to the chase, I guess that it was realizing that consciousness is where it's at if Christianity is really going to make a difference, as opposed to other ways in which Christianity is offered to us, be that through a lens of redemption, through a lens of the afterlife, through a lens of community, the various ways in which it can come to us. And so I was a clergyman, I was a priest in the Church of England in my late 20s, early 30s, and that kind of fell apart, and then took me on a process that took me to eventually Plato and then becoming a psychotherapist, because they helped me see that when you're working on yourself, then you're working on reality opening up to you all the more. But if you're not working on yourself, then reality won't open up to you all the more. And so the psychotherapy piece is the kind of practice of consciousness, if you like, that then I try and think about and write about in other ways as well.
Yeah, are you telling me I can't just read my way into all this? That's the worst news.
I think you know that already.
Yeah. Well, I do. I certainly do. So let's start with A Secret History then. Let's just kind of jump into all this. So your chosen conversation partner in that book is Owen Barfield. For those who don't know, one of the four primary inklings, and probably, as you know, like the least studied and well understood. Charles Williams might give him a run for his money on that, just because Williams is so opaque to easy reading. But I agree, there are more studies on Williams than there are on Barfield. I'm curious, what was the status quaestionis in Barfield's day on consciousness? How should we understand his work in that context?
Well, he himself related a lot to the Romantic tradition, and particularly figures like Coleridge were very important to him. Remember, amongst those inklings, Tolkien was almost a generation older than Lewis and Barfield. And Barfield and Lewis meet when they're undergraduates at Oxford. So he understood himself certainly in relation to Romanticism. They talked a lot about the status of philosophy back then, particularly in Oxford, and were very much against the grain of what emerged as various forms of positivism. And so, you know, they would have been relating to forms of idealism as well. It's sometimes said that Lewis had a form of subjective idealism before he became a Christian. I think Barfield, as soon as he latched onto his one big idea, as he put it, it would be called a form of objective idealism, but with this very participative inflection. So it's not just something that, well, it didn't really come to him by argument at all. It came to him actually through poetry and thinking about how poetry works and how poetry is in a way the art of putting words together so that a felt resonance comes through and you feel yourself responding to the words as they address you. So already you're quite deep into, well, as Barfield said, the way that words have soul. And so you can see, I think, immediately it's these kind of romantic, Platonic forms of idealism that he latches onto. I mean, the personal story is just worth saying, is that he goes up to Oxford and he finds himself profoundly depressed. He talks about this, that he became quite suicidal by the mechanistic approaches to life, which he felt were very much shaping his times. Remember, it's just after the First World War as well, where mechanism literally killed millions of people. And he wakes up from this partly through experiencing poetry, partly through falling in love. He meets the woman who became his wife as well. But what he says is that he realized, luckily for him early on, that the important thing when you have these experiences is not to try and analyze them too quickly, but is to stay with the energy, the quality that you feel. And if you can always keep that felt quality of pure communication to you alive, then you've always got something to follow and it will take you deeper. If you try and explain it too quickly, even in the hope of understanding it, you always risk explaining it away. So that was kind of his top tip for understanding consciousness, in fact, precisely not just reading about it.
Yeah, that's really great context. And I would be remiss not to ask, so I know that you have a psychotherapeutic practice. I just interviewed earlier this week my new friend Mackenzie Amara on Jungian psychotherapy. I'm really curious because Barfield, Lewis, I mean, they're more or less contemporaneous, right, with Jung and with the development of psychology. I mean, are they consciously interacting with any of that, or is that sort of off their radar? What's the relationship there?
They certainly knew about people like Carl Jung, but they didn't relate to them that closely. I mean, Barfield did a bit, because the other thing to mention about him is that when he comes to his big idea about consciousness, which I'm sure we'll come to, apart from the fact that it's there and it's the pathway to life, is that he very quickly also comes into contact with the ideas of Rudolf Steiner. You know, another figure coming out of German idealism, but with his own very particular inflection upon it. And there was always a bit of tension between Steiner and Jung, you know, that whilst I think they were onto very similar things, in fact, and nowadays, I think that's being recognized more and more, in fact. But at the time, there was quite a lot of rivalry, perhaps, between them. There's letters where Jung makes remarks about Steiner in not a very complimentary light, and so on. I mean, we make of that what you will. But the point for Barfield is it always puts him on the side more of Steiner than it does on Jung, and he much more naturally turns to Steiner for kind of wider inspiration than he does to Jung.
Yeah, and but Barfield and Williams both model what has been a principle of mine for a few years now, which is that every Christian should be reading at least one occultist fairly regularly. You know, for me, it's been John Michael Greer, who is a contemporary, you know, archdruid and writes all kinds of books on magic. And I just read him just to kind of periodically remind myself that, you know, the industrialized world of Midwestern America is not all there is.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, this relationship with esotericism, which actually people like David Bentley Hart, John Milbank, and others in, you know, otherwise mainstream theology are increasingly suggesting we do, actually. And I think that there's something about being at the kind of vanguard or the cutting edge of experiment with the way that consciousness comes to us. That said, there's also a very dry kind of esotericism, which very quickly becomes sort of formulaic, and you can certainly get that, to my mind, with Steiner, who reveals his German colors by systematizing and qualifying and breaking down, you know, to almost endless parts at times, as well as the much more well, sort of exciting, and I, you know, use the word advisedly, you know, you feel the allure, the zing, the, you know, maybe the sense of risk and danger too, with these kind of traditions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's jump into Barfield's big idea. So in A Secret History, you follow Barfield in positing 3 distinct stages of consciousness. The first of these is original participation, and you define it as a stage of consciousness in which the inner life of the cosmos is the inner life of people. And you find this stage of consciousness, and I loved this part of the book, in the oldest literary layers of the Hebrew Bible, where the Israelite God, my day job is I teach in a Jewish school, so I'm just going to say Hashem. to be respectful. So Hashem is visibly one God among other gods, right? In the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, he's the biggest God, he's the most powerful God, but like he's one God, there are other gods, right? This kind of spiritual economy of divinities is just obvious if you read the Bible without trying to make it say something it doesn't say, right? And so there are a variety of reasons that I'm really interested in this kind of thing, but I'm curious if you would agree, as we follow the evolution of consciousness in scripture, there seems to me that there's something really usefully jarring about entering into original participation, about this more, I don't know how to describe it, earthier, shamanic way of relating to God that we find in the Bible. It's not sort of the pinnacle of consciousness, but it is a really useful place to return to when we are sort of so formulaized, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you immediately touching on a really important point, apart from the idea that there's these different experiences of consciousness across time, which is that it's not a linear progression, that these are different experiences of participating with the inside of the whole world, as Barfield put it, that we can still tap into, not so as to try and go back, but to stir up our own participation now with all that's happened between then and now, and in particular with a much more powerful sense of individuality. He's like Jean Gebser like this, Gebser, who has a comparable set of stages of the evolution of consciousness, is also clear that now is not the time to just try and regress to an earlier form as if that's the goal, but to use our engagement with that in order to spark a form of consciousness and engagement that is good for now. And so it's very different from more linear accounts of development, for example. I mean, like you might see in something like Ken Wilber. It's not progressive in that sense. Barfield would call that the residue of unprocessed positivism, basically trying to map these things through a scientific lens, as if the scientific lens is the one that is the ultimate arbiter. He was very wary of that as well.
Right, and I'm thinking too, just kind of using psychotherapeutic practice as a touchstone for all of this. I'm thinking of developments in like the late 20th century in both sort of pop psychology and pop spirituality, as well as in more official settings, of trying to return to what is sometimes described as like a pre-rational, right, or super rational form of consciousness. I'm thinking of even today, like, America is filled with different kind of women's spirituality movements, men's spirituality movements. There are varying types, like there's no way to kind of characterize all of them, but several of them emphasize what I sort of lack language to describe other than to call it a kind of like return to shamanism sort of thing, right? Like return to the earth, return to like more primal emotions. That kind of what Barfield is getting at with original participation, like getting into this, I'm not conceptualizing the world, I'm just living in it kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly figures like shamans are a feature of original participation. And just incidentally, just by original, I think he doesn't mean it's going all the way back to the emergence of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago. It's really the original participation that you can get to grips with through literary texts, because they go back to maybe 3,000 years ago, something like that. Which is what he studied. He found this out actually quite empirically through the study of words, and tracking how words have changed meaning, and then realizing that much as words communicate the felt sense of being alive to us now, so they would have done back then, and so you can use them as fossils of consciousness too. And so he looks back to earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, figures like Homer in Greek literature, and then people have extended it to other literature as well, say in India, and realize that meaning comes, or the sense of being connected to things comes, you might say, from the outside in rather than from the inside out, which is how we tend to automatically approach these things. And so things like ritual, shamanism, the practices which you can read about in, say, the patriarchal period of the Hebrew Bible, they are much more about how to navigate the forces which are around and about through libations, through sacrifices, trying to understand meaning by listening for what's coming back, as it were, and whether that be by reading signs or figures like angels appearing. And this all adds up to a mode of existence that Barfield thinks we should take quite seriously. It has its own sophistication, though. This is another thing he stresses very much, that it has its own nuance, complexity, already evident traditions, that they, as it were, are there fully on the page already, the gods of Mount Olympus or whatever it might be. And so but that's part of the engagement, I guess, is that we see a kind of mirror for our own consciousness that throws up the shadows of our own consciousness as much as the value of it, because it's a kind of equal and complementary consciousness. To put it in short, it's why people still find this benefit in reading Homer or reading the Hebrew Bible. It still speaks to us, but not in such direct ways as more recent literature would, but almost as a kind of something just over the horizon that still sort of shines indirectly in our own minds.
Oh yeah, I mean, reading Homer, especially if you can read him in Greek, right? Reading Homer is a religious experience. Like it just is. If you're not coming away, if you don't read about Zeus sitting on Mount Ida overlooking the world, right, and being implored by Thetis to honor Achilles, and you don't come away from that with a sense of, no, yeah, I get it. Like I get why someone would worship the Zeus of Homer, right? You're not really reading Homer. Like you don't get it, right?
Yeah, and Barfield was really clear. And actually, this is how I got into Barfield, because I did my PhD on Plato, and I got the PhD, but I felt the whole time I really hadn't got to grips with what Plato was on about. And then someone said to me, "Have you ever read Owen Barfield?" And in one of his books, he has this whole section on how you have to unthink what you think you know about figures like Plato, because the words which get translated into English, and even if you read them in the Greek, it's too easy to just use a word like theoria in the way that we do now. And you have to unthink all that, and then it starts to come and shine through to you. And similarly in Homer, I don't know this so well as you might, but I think that a lot of the original descriptions get smoothed out in modern translations. So it will never say, this might not be directly right, but the sort of thing it would never say is Achilles ran across the battlefield. It would say the legs, swiftly, like flew across the battlefield or something like that. And this is already pointing to the sense that for a figure like Achilles, their many body parts corresponded to different forces and agencies, deities, in the cosmos round and about. And so life was about navigating that kind of flood of meaning. Achilles' problem is the world meaningful? It's how am I going to ride this wave of meaning? So relationships with the gods and so on are so different in that respect.
Yeah, and I think when we get back to biblical literature, this is the value in modern translation of people like Robert Alter or people like David Bentley Hart with his New Testament translation, right? That they are both pitilessly correct and literal in their translations, right? That like, no, look, deal with what the word means first. Like before you construct any kind of meaning beyond that, like just try to understand what the text says, right? And let yourself be offended, let yourself be startled, let yourself be taken aback. Like I thought I knew what this said, but I actually didn't. Like what I thought it said is sort of like a third layer of reception or something, right? So it seems to me that like we need to go back to this original participation in our reading of texts and also in our reading of the world a lot of the time, because I'm thinking of, you wrote that excellent article on Dante for Aeon, which I will get to a little bit later on. But there was another article in the Psyche magazine that Aeon runs about Taoism and Taoist concepts of time. Can't think of the author's name, but he says in there that there's this Taoist idea that, you know, animals are closer to the Tao than humans because they have no concept of the Tao, right? They're not trying to conceptualize this like great mystery of existence. They're just existing. And that makes them intrinsically better followers of the way than humans who are like caught up in all of these intervening concepts. But speaking of intervening concepts, let's talk about withdrawal of participation. So that's stage 2 for Barfield and for you. If we cyclically move through these stages in a recapitulatory manner, it seems to me fair to say that we live in an era defined by this kind of consciousness, right? My inner life is not the inner life of nature or the gods. And in fact, because my inner life is so separated from the inner life of nature and the gods, I might come to suspect that nature has no inner life and there are no gods, right? This is what Paul Tyson describes kind of slowly in his 7 Brief Lessons on Magic as he's diagnosing the mechanical theory of nature. What are the uses and the dangers of withdrawal for the evolution of consciousness? Because I feel like we talk about withdrawal and I feel an immediate like, withdrawal, like my least favorite stage of consciousness, right? But surely there's a purpose for this, yeah?
Yeah, so definitely, and Barfield was very clear that whilst the withdrawal of consciousness leads to feelings of alienation, you know, the suicidality that even he experienced, there is a meaning into the suffering, which I think you can summarize as it throws you back on yourself. And you have to search for meaning within yourself, which has the benefit of developing your sense of self, and particularly your sense of individuality. But if that's where it leaves you, then you've, as it were, fallen to the bottom of the hole and haven't worked out how to find the way out, because the idea then is that it leads you all the more richly to engage with the inside of the whole world once more. But unlike, you know, the animal that doesn't even think whether there's such a thing as the Tao, you're able to do that more consciously. And so that is important. This is why Barfield is very much within the Christian tradition, because he sees that conscious recognition that I can say I am, which he thinks is really the thing that Jesus constellates and crystallizes in this evolutionary process, means it becomes possible to perceive of the divine I am. And in fact, it's only because the divine I am is that we can even begin to contemplate that we might be able to say I am as well. And so this is the benefit. It's the conscious appreciation of resonating not just with the natural world, which, you know, is in earlier times, but with a world that exceeds the natural world. Forgive the using the word nature in that way, which I know David Bentley Hart would immediately jump on. But nonetheless, so the point is that it expands your perception of reality. And so it becomes possible to know that reality is one, and various monotheisms described in different traditions become perceivable by humanity. And so that's the upside, is that you consciously know more about things, for all that comes through this difficulty of, but what is the Tao, or all the very direct feelings of alienation and meaninglessness.
Right. In the alienation, the sense of absence can be itself useful, right? So I'm thinking in the Hebrew Bible that, you know, God sort of continuously gets more and more transcendent until you get to like really late texts like Esther or Ruth, where in Ruth, God is mentioned, in Esther, God is not, right? And like God doesn't directly do anything in either book. But these are still in the canon, and like the argument in late antiquity about whether or not these were scripture really revolved around kind of coming to grips with this concept of like, is it possible that God is present because he is absent as an individual entity, right? Like he is ubiquitously present in the text because he is not mentioned, or because he does not say or do anything. And this reflects, of course, like, I mean, you know, early Jews in the exilic and post-exilic periods, I mean, they're coming into contact with international expectations about divinity, right? They're coming into contact with Persian religion, with Greek religion and philosophy. You find Greek Jews, you find Greeks who know about Judaism, drawing equivocations between like philosophical Zeus and the biblical God, right? And so I guess I'm interested though. So withdrawal of participation, it makes possible this kind of monotheism, this philosophical monotheism. But when we chase philosophical monotheism to its logical conclusions, right? And you've talked about this at length with Rupert Sheldrake and with others, we end up almost logically having to go for like an idealism and a panpsychism, right? Because if God is truly the one, the infinite one, right, then we cannot posit like a final barrier between God and the world, right? Like God's oneness has to be inclusive of the world. It has to be like a kind of non-dual unity between God and everything. And it seems to me, at least, that living in an age of withdrawal, idealist panpsychism, these kind of, these trippier non-dual metaphysics, they're very appealing to, like, I understand their logic and I adhere to them. And I like, yes, this is a much better theory of reality. But as an experience of reality, I find it really opaque, right? Like I find it difficult to transition from, I understand the concept of this, to this is how I experience things when I like walk outside my door, right? Or when I'm just sitting in my house. How do we move through that? And I imagine psychotherapy has a role to play.
Yeah. Well, to refer to something that Barfield was very interested in, actually, was what happens when East meets West. And on the one hand, you have traditions like Advaita Vedanta and non-dualist traditions coming into the West and speaking very powerfully to people. But I think that as that happens, the West almost kind of says, look, great, I get your vision, and it's very beautifully and clearly put by figures like Shankara and interpreters, modern as well as earlier. But what status does the world as we experience it have in its diversity as well as in its unity? And I think that I'm wondering whether this is increasingly going to be something that the West, with Platonic and Trinitarian traditions, actually adds to traditions like Advaita Vedanta, because there is quite a debate in Advaita Vedanta about the status of Maya. Is it illusion that you see as nothing? As it does, it's regarded that way quite substantially in renunciate traditions. Once you've had the awakening, the best thing to do is go up a mountain and live in a cave and have as little to do with manifest reality as possible. And that is, others would say that's deeply unsatisfying, that the world in its diversity is the joyful or playful expression of Brahman. You can now read Advaita teachers saying. But that then raises the question, which the Trinitarian traditions have got a lot of experience in trying to grapple with, which is, okay, so as it were, on this plane, you can say that it's Brahman's playfulness, but does that mean that within the life of Brahman, in Brahman's self, there's a kind of multiple playfulness as well? Because if there isn't, then you've got a dualism popping up again. We're in the playfulness, but Brahman has some sort of hidden essence that is beyond any playfulness. And I think that, figures like David Bentley Hart, again, they're really key here because they know both traditions really richly, and they're able to use ideas that have been developed in Trinitarian theology to understand how, your being, my being is one being, divine being, that appreciates both the unity, the glorious unity of that vision, but also the multiplicity of that vision as well. Now that is sort of to deal with it at quite a theoretical level, but I think it opens up possibilities for how we experience it as well, because it, for people who are finding their way towards these things, maybe have had the basic awakening that my consciousness is not my own consciousness, but is the awareness which not only we all share, but is the ground of all being. So it's sort of like what happens next, as you're saying, what happens when you step out the front door again, and appreciating how, well, actually, in terms of just pure communication, I find that the Sufi tradition has a lot of very useful metaphors here. So, one quite common one is how you can have many shards of glass reflecting the one light, but although the reflections are many, they're only reflecting the one light. So metaphors like that, I think, begin to make a lot more sense of this tradition as it comes into the West, which has this much stronger sense of individuality, and so isn't so quickly persuaded by ideas of, I don't know, the salt individual dissolving into the vast oceanness of consciousness. It feels like something gets lost there if that's all you say. And there's something true about that, I think. I mean, other metaphors, that it always strikes me with other metaphors too, so there's the famous metaphor about thinking it's a snake on the path when actually it's a rope, and then you see it's really a rope. Now, that is very powerful insofar as it goes, but it always feels a bit sad for me because the snake is alive and the rope isn't. And so what happens to that vitality? And yeah, so I think that this mixing of East and West is going to be really interesting. Even right now, I feel like a lot of conversations that people are having, that you can listen to on the internet are really getting there now, with these kind of issues.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of the perspectival multiplicity that is widely reported in people who have psychedelic experiences or who practice other forms of mystical consciousness, right? This kind of my perspective shapes what I see, right, and shapes how I experience it, and that's real. And it might also be true that like things that are superficially contradictory to that are real on whatever plane of reality is being accessed here. They're like, unless you're God, there's no God-eyed perspective on the spiritual and material worlds that would allow you to kind of strictly, like impose a taxonomy, I guess, on the experiences of consciousness. Which I think, even just as kind of an intellectual canon of like, I'm just not going to judge when somebody tells me this is what I've seen, right? Or this is what I've experienced, or this is what I'm what I'm consciously aware of. I feel like it's really useful for contemporary Christians to just get used to saying, all right, cool, right? I've through college and grad school, I had a variety of friends who were neo-pagans or who like converted to Buddhism and would tell me about experiences that they had, or like, yeah, like, I met this God when I went to this ritual the other day. And my attitude was just always one of like, no, yeah, cool. I see no utility, but I also see no good intellectual reason to kind of get in your face about this and say like, no, that's not the way reality really is, right? So yeah, I'm wondering.
Yeah, and it's there in the Christian tradition, but it's just got lost. So St. Francis talked about Brother Sun and Sister Moon, and there were the Beguines, this extraordinary women's movement right across medieval Europe, where tens of thousands of women, now it's becoming clear, had these very direct experiences, very colorful experiences of the riotous presence of the divine in their lives and in nature. So it is there, but it's just got lost in the meantime. I think, maybe just to say a little bit more about this appearance in the Hebrew Bible as well, around the exilic period. This is the period when I was writing my book. So what I wanted to do as much as anything is to see whether Barfield's ideas stack up in the light of biblical scholarship that actually had come on quite a long way, even in the time since he died in the 1990s. And it was a great delight to find that it really supports his ideas. It's a really good lens through which to read a lot of what's emerging in biblical studies, and particularly how things change in the Deuteronomic period, and how the law of Deuteronomy can be read as fostering a very different consciousness of the divine by sort of forcing really a wrestling with yourself. And then very dramatic changes are made. So, for example, the sins of the father don't visit the children in the Deuteronomic literature as they had done previously, because there is this more sense of individual engagement with the law and with the divine. that wasn't there before. The business of writing down texts as well, what a difference that makes compared to oral traditions, which of course happens around the exilic and then the early post-exilic period, because then you have to make the text come alive in between you and the text, not as part of a group as in an oral tradition, where you might go on pilgrimage to a place and very much perform the truth through sacrifices and so on. So that reading of the text itself fosters a sense of interiority, and that the divine is found in this interiority. And figures like Jan Assmann, actually, who, the famous Egyptologist, he's shown actually across a number of cultures how the sense of transcendence increases with the appearance of writing, precisely because infinity is felt inside, and so therefore can be experienced outside through that engagement with the written word. There was lots of other details which delighted me, like the appearance of individual burials rather than being buried in ancestral land. And this is a massive feature of the Hebrew Bible, where the kings and so on are buried. And then, of course, Moses is explicitly said we don't know where his burial place is to this day. That's not just an incidental detail. That is conveying a massive shift of consciousness. And he's the pilgrim that never arrives, and so on. So it partly comes about because I think of the exile, and so the ancestral lands, for example, and the temple just weren't available. But much as the alienation now feels distressing, actually being a new set of revelations of the divine. So then, of course, it leads to a new revelation of the divine, a renewal of the tradition. And I mean, like you were saying with Book of Esther and Ruth, I think part of what they're about is saying that Jews are no longer people who live in Judah. They're an ethnicity, and they don't carry the tabernacle around as an external object anymore. It's carried around in some way inside themselves. And so the presence of the divine is experienced and then written about very differently.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too of like James Kugel's. Are you familiar with Kugel?
I don't also actually know.
Oh, you would love his work. So
the name again?
Sorry?
James
Kugel.
Kugel,
He's a Jewish scholar of biblical interpretation. So I've got right here on my desk the Bible as it was, which is basically just like a collection of early Jewish expansions and commentaries and interpretations of biblical stories. And he's also got a book called The Great Shift about how God goes from being, kind of a local deity who is maybe like, the secret king of the gods or something, who like takes Israel for himself and fights other gods, to becoming this like, transcendent God with a capital G. And one of the benefits of that, it seems to me, is that whereas previously, because God is on a level with all these other gods, we have to be very careful, right, to just stick close to him. When God becomes so transcendent, that's when we get all of these hierarchies of divine beings, of like gods and angels and deified patriarchs and prophets, right? Why do we not know where Moses's burial is? Well, in Deuteronomy, it is this sense, right, of the pilgrim who never makes it. In early Jewish literature, it's because Moses became a god at the end of his life, right? He became an angel and he went to heaven. And that's why we don't know where his tomb is, because it doesn't matter, right? And it's like, look, we wouldn't get any of that if God doesn't become so ubiquitous that like we're no longer focused on a particular image of him, but rather we're invited to see like the whole cosmos is theophanic, right? I mean, so that Dionysian idea that you get later on in Pseudo-Denis, it's already there in early Jewish literature. This like it's not explicitly said, but there is this notion that like, look, the whole cosmos is sort of the like theophanic body of God. And then in later Jewish tradition, this is like the Shir Koma, right? Like the divine body that in Kabbalistic texts is like ridiculously large, right? Like God's beard is like 10 universes long or something, right? Which is awesome. But also like, it's the point of that absurdism is explicitly to say like, it's gesturing at this non-dualism, right? That really monotheism invites you to see God in everything and expressing himself as everything, Brahman's Lila, to use the Vedantic terminology. So let's get into.
I mean, maybe just
Yeah.
have a thought about angelology, because that
Please.
is so fascinating too, and of course, really blossoms in what Christians would call the intertestamental period. You know, which is when Moses is written about as sitting at the right hand of God, even, I think. You know, it becomes so important in the time of Jesus, because the transcendence of the divine then also always raises the question of, so how does the divine communicate immanently in the created order? And so pagan deities, which had been very much associated with places, becoming angelic presences which channel or communicate divine intelligence. That's a very natural move to make. And you know, I think this is really important, actually, because quite often, certainly in the popular media, you can read about how Christianity trashed paganism. And I think, no doubt, some of that happened. But the deeper point is that Christianity wanted to preserve the life that was perceived in pagan traditions, but alongside this perception of divine transcendence, which of course is really important for the sovereignty of the individual as well. And so messengers going between the divine up and down hierarchies, which of course are about transmitting the life, not separating you from the divine life, that becomes, you know, they're very vividly imagined and perceived.
Right, not least by Lewis, right? So I'm thinking like Michael Ward's Planet Narnia thesis, which is, I mean, I reread that book every fall simply because I think it's a beautiful piece of scholarship, but also because, I mean, Lewis is just he's a first-rate master at evangelizing our imaginations. I mean, like if you read Narnia and if you read the Space Trilogy, knowing what Lewis is up to with all of his pre-Copernican cosmology, it's amazing how well he can make you believe in a dead worldview, right? Like he's extremely talented at making you believe it without making you believe it as like a literal, you know, scientific structure to the universe. And it's exactly that kind of thing, I think. Like the golden $1 million question is, how do you keep doing that with everything else? Right? It's how do you do that again without just, you know, trying to ape Lewis or something? You know, it's the same question with Tolkien and fantasy literature, right? Like, people have recently complained that there's, you know, shelves and shelves and shelves of J.R.R. Tolkien, and so other fantasy authors have a hard time breaking in. And it's like, look, that's a fair complaint. At the same time, a lot of the fantasy written over the last 60 years is just like trying to copy Tolkien. Right? It's like trashy paperback novels that, you know, use all of Tolkien's stuff just without being as good as Tolkien. So of course, of course, we would just rather sell and read and consume him, you know. So it's that question of repetition of like, how do we do what they did without just, you know, bare mimicry, I guess.
So, I mean, it's very rich what you say. Actually, the immediate thought was, I'm a huge fan of a more recent book, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is almost like, it's quite a short fantasy novel, but does something in the fantasy genre, no doubt, but really I think is going to be increasingly recognized as quite a pivotal book because it's doing it in a fresh way, which feels appropriate for now, partly because it focuses very much on the experience of one individual. It's in what seems like quite a narrow world, rather than a whole, you know, fully conceived, even with its own languages, world like Tolkien. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's partly to say that I wonder whether these traditions are being remade now because there's a need to have them remade, because fantasy literature is one of the ways that we can recover a sense of participation, and figures like Tolkien and Lewis were really important at a certain point. I mean, I think also Dante is really crucial here. You know, he writes 700 years ago, and I think partly he speaks to us still because he writes at the beginning of this sort of modern consciousness. You know, sometimes said that he lived in the period of the first industrial revolution. Things like mercantilism, early forms of banking and so on are really starting to change ways of life in particularly northern Italy, and that of course changes how people experience themselves. And, you know, a bit like reading Plato, the great thing about going back to these figures that were at the origins of a key part of how we experience ourselves now is that you can feel the fresh shoots sort of pushing up. And so directly get invited to not to go back, but to remake for now. Yeah, so there's something both about fantasy, actually maybe it is being remade, but also about going back to the moments where things shift, and where you get these extraordinary writers like Plato, like Dante, because you know, at the origin they help connect us to the deeper origins.
Yeah, there's something in the air. I need to read Clark. I have watched the BBC show for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which was incredible, I thought, and I need to read that novel. But I like the theme in that story too, of exactly this thing, right? That there's one vision of magic that's very mechanistic, and there's another vision of magic that's borderline shamanic, right? And like much more original participation. And kind of the whole story, like the meta story of that narrative is that, you know, there's this synthesis that's being slowly affected through the drama of these two characters, which kind of brings me to reciprocal participation. So this is the third phase of consciousness for Barfield. If I understand this correctly, it's basically a more fully worked out notion of the human being as microcosm, right? Human inner life reflects the inner life of cosmos, gods, and God, but it also has its own autonomy, however limited, its own meaning-making power, its own moral agency. It almost seems to me, like you were mentioning idealism earlier, it seems to me like it's the integration of like thesis and antithesis in a synthesis almost, right? Like the thesis of original participation, the antithesis of withdrawal, and then a synthesis through reciprocation. Barfield and you associate the development of this stage of consciousness with the life of Jesus itself. So I'm interested, how does Jesus perform this integration? Like how does that synthesis happen?
Yeah, just in parenthesis, the phrase reciprocal participation Barfield does use, but relatively rarely actually. I latched onto it because for me it makes more sense than his much more common phrase, which is final participation. Now, he tends to mean final as in telos, sort of direction, goal. But I feel that gets a bit lost. It's like everything's going to be wrapped up. I don't think he meant that at all. But reciprocal spoke to me because, as you say, this perception of the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, which you get in certainly the medieval period, late antiquity and the medieval period. Yeah, so for Barfield, Jesus becomes this seminal figure, particularly around the Mediterranean world, because I actually think in his lifetime, I think that the scholarship does make this stack up, but certainly upon reflection, people perceived that not just that this was a meeting of the human and the divine, because that happened before in many figures, but that it was precisely because of the complete fullness of Jesus's humanity, without reserve, you know, to the point of death. That complete fullness without reserve was what enabled the complete without reserve presence of the divine to be known in this figure as well. And so you get the sort of the culmination of this long process, you know, since maybe 500, 400 years before Jesus, where this was beginning to wake up, seen to have, I don't know, you know, humanity, as it were, stepped out of the cave. And once you know that there's a world outside the cave, even if you go back in the cave, you kind of want to know what it's like outside again. And so it became an inflection point, a point of no return. But, you know, no doubt in history, takes 200 or 300 years to reach the historical stage. But the seed was planted and it was sprouting in the life of Jesus. Now, I think there are Barfield tells this in the Christian world as it became, because that's the world he knows. But I think you can draw parallels, which I've looked at a bit through studies of the axial age, both in India and in China. It feels like actually the birth of Advaita Vedanta, you know, which really comes from commentaries on earlier texts like the Bhagavad Gita, but re-understanding those texts in the light of and its sense of the individual that had emerged in, say, the 3rd, 4th centuries after Christ. And then similarly, I think, certainly in Taoist traditions, figures like, I know, Xuanzi feels more like an individual than, say, Lao Tzu. And so you can, I'm slightly on thinner ground here. I don't know this nearly so well, as much as I know the Indian tradition either, actually, but nonetheless, I have heard people make this argument that you can track these traditions evolving similarly, certainly in Taoism anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, maybe as a consequence of how much closer we are to it in history, maybe for other reasons. I mean, Jesus is more of an individual than Moses is, right? Like, I mean, and that is not a criticism of Moses at all. It's just to note that, I mean, Moses, the way that he is portrayed in the synthesis of different documents that is the Torah, right, is essentially, I mean, like, he's a mythic foundation hero. And that's not to say I don't think there was a real Moses. Like, I think there was a real Moses, right? It's just to say that the Moses that I'm getting out of the text is like, the point is not, oh, like Moses actually hit the rock and water came out of it, right? The point is, like, look, Moses is the Israelite Hammurabi. He's the Israelite, he is this sort of Aboriginal, prophet, king, priest figure. And it's clear when you read the Torah that, different documents kind of don't know what to do with Aaron, right? For that reason, like there's this reduplication of roles throughout the Hebrew Bible that you can see, because these larger than life, kind of almost mythologized figures actually are the ones who fill all of these roles, and the institutions are kind of later diminutions of what they were doing, right? So this is why, David and the Davidic kings in the Hebrew Bible are clearly like divine beings on earth. Like it is a sacral kingship. I think you note this actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think the period of the kings is really important for the emergence of individuality, because the kings become kind of individuals, but they're rather collective individuals. People look at the king and see their individuality in this figure, who is very closely associated with Yahweh. But of course, the king, as king, is a flawed figure too, and so things go wrong, and a lot of the Bible is interested in tracking what goes wrong. But it's seeded the idea that there can be an individual human, and so the next step, quite naturally, is to take that individuality into yourself and perceive the meeting point between Yahweh and the human within yourself as an individual. And so that is deeply connected to this emergence of the Christian incarnation. I mean, maybe also just to say in parenthesis that, of course, Judaism too changes about this time with the birth of Rabbinic Judaism after the Second Temple. So after the destruction of the Second Temple, and all the great commentaries, of course, on the Hebrew texts, they don't start to emerge 700 years or so after the texts are written down just by chance. It's because there's a shift of consciousness about then, and so a new engagement has to be found with them. And the great rabbis of the first and second centuries are engaged in that remaking of Judaism too.
Yeah, and that's already going on too, right, in Jesus's own time. I mean, I'm thinking of like C.D. Elledge's argument about resurrection, that resurrection is, as a doctrine, it actually emerges from scribes trying to make sense of the crisis that the ancient Near East experienced with the Macedonian conquests, right? Where local traditions, local ways of life that had kind of been rebuilt in many places after, Babylonian and Persian conquest are just radically changed in a way that they never have been before, right? And like theodicy itself is on the table. Like, how is God just when there is all this like death and conquest and everything else going on? And the scribal answer is like, well, God will raise the dead. And it's like, what does that mean? And you like, that's actually never resolved in early Judaism and Christianity, right? There continue to be two fairly opposed interpretations of what resurrection is that are just sort of included within both traditions. And also in Islam, it's the same bifurcation. Is resurrection just restoration to like this kind of, fleshy existence, or is it like resurrection as an angel? Sorry, I got very old English there for a second. As an angel, in like an astral body or something.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why, again, David Bentley Hart's engagement with the New Testament is so fascinating, because this is coming out. I mean, I've in his latest book, Roland and Moonlight, David does mention Barfield. He likes the idea, I think, that consciousness changes, but is a bit wary of Barfield's approach. He says it's a bit too Kantian. It's a bit Western for him, I guess. And I think what he means by that is that there's a tendency to try and use reason to find a way into this rather than say participation. But he, Barfield clearly wants to use participation. But nonetheless, it's going to be interesting, I think, if David does develop particularly what I think he's working on quite a lot now, which is so-called Gnosticism in this period, and how that gets lost in biblical translations, because the archons don't get called archons and all the rest of it. And but whether he'll move more and more to a sense that this in-between period precisely has these different strands, because there's a search for what this means, and that search can only produce fruits when human consciousness itself changes. And this is not just a sort of external puzzle to try and work out, as is often treated today. It actually requires your perception to change, to know the fullness, and this sort of in-between tropological withdrawn periods where things are unsure is absolutely crucial. And again, I think this is why scriptures still speak to us, because they capture that moment of change, not just everything resolved and, as it were, laid out on a page. That would be deadening, in fact.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the older I get, when I was in undergrad and grad school and I was asked to read about psychology of religion, it was always a turnoff for me, because the way that I had been taught to do religious studies was, look, in a secular context, I bracket questions of transcendent meaning so that I can just get at what's going on in a religion, right? Just try to understand the texts on their own terms, understand the people on their own terms, all of that. And it always seemed to me like the literature that I was being asked to read cheated on that, in that sense, because it was very reductionistic in its psychologization of religion. But the older I get, the more I recognize that actually, evolutionary psychology and changes in consciousness, these are the things that absolutely propel development of doctrine, development of practice, changes in community organization, even changes in mystical awareness across religious traditions, right? There's a reason that, Isaiah sees the seraphim, but Ezekiel sees the cherubim, and John of Patmos sees 4 living creatures, which are kind of both of them, right? There's something going on in that. It's not purely that, on one level, it is purely that, everybody sees different things when they're in mystical states of consciousness. But there's another level in which it's they are enculturated in particular ways, right? Their awareness of how things work is different from Isaiah functioning in the 8th century BCE to Ezekiel functioning during the exilic period, right? This raises a question for me in our context, and again, coming back to psychotherapy. So, my conversation with Mackenzie earlier this week, she remarked to me that, for Jung, the Western psyche had wrapped itself around Christ effectively. And his project was really trying to reckon with the psychology of Christianity. So I'm really curious about kind of where we stand now in terms of that psychology of Christianity in Western consciousness. In our period of withdrawal, how is our psyche being influenced by Christ in the Western world, positively, negatively, and otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's something in the argument that certainly in the UK is made quite often now, in this decade after the decade of new atheism, which is that we're still Christians, really. It's just that no one goes to church and no one confesses Christ. But certainly in our moral sensibilities, it's inherited from Christianity. I think there's a lot in that, but it also makes me really nervous, because I think the minute that any wisdom tradition, and certainly Christianity, is treated as if it's just a moral set of imperatives or even a moral feeling for the world, is the minute that you're really losing touch with the source of it, because it's got to be about perceptions of ontological reality. And morality for me is always a bit of a debased virtue approach, because virtues is about your personality, your character, the qualities of your own existence that can then perceive or not wider existence, through harmony, through participation and resonance and so on. So if you're already talking about morality, you've already taken a step back, because then it's about, are you doing the right thing? And you're judged by your action rather than by the quality of your engagement with life. I want to sort of push back against that argument that Christianity is still shaping us. And I guess that Jung was onto that. I mean, he's so complicated, Jung, because sometimes he wants to be an empirical psychologist, sometimes he wants to be more of a theologian. I think he was just sort of wrong about certain things in Platonic Christianity as well, most famously about the nature of evil. I do think it is the absence of good rather than something ontologically grounded in its own right, this famous argument that he has. But I think Jung also needs to be, certainly in the psychotherapy world, he needs to be understood alongside the Freudian and post-Freudian traditions, which were much more straightforwardly atheistic, for all that they couldn't put the divine down. Freud repeatedly returns to the question and so on, and makes up his own myths to try and account for things. And a figure who's really interesting for me in all this actually is someone who's very significant in British psychotherapy, the figure of Donald Winnicott. And I think he's interesting because he's actually also in the Romantic tradition too. I think he actually was very influenced by people like Coleridge in terms of his understanding of what's going on in psychotherapy. But he has notions which are very powerful and I think mirror Christian mysticism. So, for example, he would say that one of the things that can happen to us that leads us into psychotherapy is when our false selves become uncoupled from our true self. Now, he doesn't mean this in the sense of the existentialists. What he means is that we all have ways that we incarnate or show up in the world, which he calls false selves with inverted commas. And they serve us well when they connect us to the world and to the wellspring of our being, which he calls the true self. But it's very easy, particularly in the modern world, to identify with the false self, and then the sense of life drains out and you have a breakdown, you get burnt out, whatever it might be, and because you've lost touch with the wellspring. And so I think that is a very rich idea that leads very naturally into the perceptions of Christian mysticism and, no doubt others. One very practical way that I try and think about it is that whilst people will come to you in psychotherapy with very pressing problems causing suffering, and you need to take those seriously on their own terms, the aim always is to try and see more than just the suffering kind of around it. And then there's this strange paradox that the suffering itself can even enable people to do that. The suffering sort of becomes the way of seeing there's more than just the suffering. So some forms of psychotherapy, like say clinical psychology, behavioral psychotherapy, just focus on the alleviation of the suffering, and that's not to be sniffed at because suffering is suffering. But there is another possibility here, which, would be used in these very familiar Christian phrases, which are immensely rich, like following the way of the cross, because that is the way to experience the side of yourself that's more than what, day by day may be causing you such problems. And there's something about tending to the problems that makes you start to see around them. Yeah, and then in Eastern traditions, this would be called witnessing what's going on, and that witnessing is the first crucial step to certainly in Advaita Vedanta, understanding the true nature of the presence of awareness and so on.
Yeah, and I think already in the New Testament, there's this sense of Christianity as a practice of egoic death, right? So Jesus says, take up, like, you cannot be my disciple unless you take up the cross. And then there's this great line from Paul that, when this clicked for me, it was huge. It was, when he says, I have died in Christ, and now it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, right? It is no longer I, it is literally no longer ego, right? That lives. It is Christ who lives in me. So there's this egoic death and Christian resurrection. So speaking of false selves, being stripped away. Speaking of egoic death, let's get to Dante.
Okay, well, that's it. Can I just leap in? I can't wait to get to Dante. But egoic death, but with the important Krishna corollary that it leads to life. And because sometimes people, in modern spiritual circles talk about sort of smashing the ego or whatever. I think actually it's about the ego sort of being transcended. I mean, I remember this became very clear to me when I worked in a mental health hospital where people's egos really are smashed and it's a disaster. It ruins lives. So what we're invited, I think, to understand, and this is part of the nuance and the direct perception that's required, is that the finite self needs to be understood not as separate, this is an advanced way of putting it, but as the manifestation of the infinite self. Or, in the Sufi tradition, it's the fragment of the glass that reflects the one light. And I think, similarly, as you're saying, it's no longer I that live. Paul's still clearly an individual. My goodness, you get that on every page of St. Paul as well. But nonetheless, he knows that it's Christ that lives within him. So that's the transformation that we seek to understand.
Yeah, and it's a transformation that I think superficially many people presume has nothing to do with Christianity, right? That's Eastern, or that's that's psychology speaking or something. But it's actually, if you read the Desert Fathers, right? Like, just read the Desert Fathers and look at all the wrestling that they do with false selves and with, look at the absolute receptivity to the world that they seek to have exactly through their ascetic renunciation of the world, right?
Figures like Evagrius Ponticus, they can be mapped almost directly, in fact, onto modern psychotherapists like Melanie Klein, whose sort of structures of what shows up when you look inside are very, very similar. Jesus was a great psychologist. He was a lot more besides, but and a great way of putting it across as well. Why are you worried about the speck in your brother's eye when there's a plank in your own? I mean, there's no greater summary of projection than that. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Dante. I've not yet read your new book on Dante. I'm excited to, but I have read your Aeon article on the subject. I read Dante for the first time in the 6th grade, actually. I was a precocious reader when I was a kid, and I found myself just mesmerized by his poetry in translation. I don't read Italian. Everyone seems to have only ever read the Inferno, which was fun for me, but it was fun the way that a haunted house is fun, It was fun the way that I think Halloween movies are fun. It was really the Purgatorio and the Paradiso that stirred my religious imagination when I was a kid. My first question about Dante now, having come out of graduate school where my background really focused on apocalyptic literature, do you think his poetry stems from some sort of real religious experience, or is it purely literary conceit? And this is a huge argument with apocalyptic literature by scholars. Are apocalypticists really having visions and then articulating those visions in the context of an apocalypse, or are they purely literary artists, right? I'm a both and kind of guy. So I don't think that I don't think that it is mutually contradictory to say that the author of the Book of the Watchers is probably a visionary kind of guy who has weird visions. And then he is also crafting a very careful literary portrait of those visions. But not everybody agrees with me. So I'm wondering what the situation is for Dante. Is there any scholarship on this? What's your take on it?
Yeah, well, it's debated in Dante studies. In fact, I just reviewed the new Oxford Handbook of Dante, and whilst the editors explicitly say this is truth that's conjured up through repetition and performance, and they reference people like A.L. Austin and Judith Butler very directly. Luckily, from my point of view, there are contributors to the handbook that make the opposite case, or for me, the fuller case, which is no, this was a real experience. But you see, because it's a real experience of reality, it's not just a private experience. that immediately opens up for Dante all the traditions that are around and about. And so he can incorporate them into his own experience and make them into this extraordinary thing that is the Divine Comedy. So it is both and in the richest possible sense. The reason why he can bring all these, all aspects of, the ancient world, the Christian world, the Islamic world, for the philosophical world of Aristotle and Plato so incredibly to life is precisely because it is real. If he was just messing with it, it wouldn't really fly, I think. So for me, it's the fact that it's such brilliant poetry is precisely what makes it self-evidently to me now, the experience that he actually knew and had. And again, this shouldn't really surprise us, because anyone who's had some sort of peak experience, say Dante did have some sort of non-dual experience, whilst he was in exile wandering around northern Italy, he could have treated it as a good trip, a bit of a consolation so long as the feeling lasted. But luckily he was a genius with language, and so was able to incorporate it into his, I think, every moment of his life by working its gift into this. The poem was his spiritual practice, put it like that.
Yeah, I think what the argument misses, whether we're talking about apocalypses or we're talking about Dante or whatever, and I mean, generically speaking, the Divine Comedy is an apocalypse, at least in terms of literary genre, right? Human recipient, otherworldly mediary, right? Vision of another world. But I mean, whatever we're talking about, the argument always seems to miss to me that producing literature is itself, and like it's an altered state of consciousness kind of activity, right? So when I wrote a review for Al Kimmel's blog of Roland and Moonlight, where I kind of played around at the beginning with saying, I'm not going to opine whether these conversations with Roland are something that Hart has actually experienced or not. Because even if he were to claim that they are not, that doesn't actually mean that he hasn't had them, right? Even if this is purely a literary fiction that he has conceived and done, that's still not the same as saying that these conversations with Roland are not real, right? So you mentioned earlier that like Dante is responding to this avant-garde of modernity with the Divine Comedy. He senses something in the air. He is trying to provide a resource maybe for resisting, or at least like making sense of that influence. How does Dante show us the way forward for integration in like reciprocal consciousness, like in reciprocal participation?
And it is a remaking, it is an evolution. It's not just him recovering from his midlife crisis when he wakes up midway through the course of our life in the dark wood, and in the tangible experience of his exile. He doesn't just become reconciled to that. It's suffering that opens up reality to him. So I think, one way of putting this, there's lots of lovely things one could say about this, but one way of putting it is that he, much like Virgil, meets him in the woods where he's at, and Beatrice doesn't appear for quite some time, because that would just be a blast, and that he wouldn't be able to make enough of before the transformations that occur through the Inferno and the Purgatorio. So too, I think he meets us where we're at still. Now, at one level, this happens literally because he adopts this schema of hell, purgatory, and paradise, which I don't think was universal actually, even at that time, but was, increasingly current, actually, not least through Islamic influence as well. But he takes that as a kind of starting point. But the minute you certainly enter the gates of hell and read what's written above the gates of hell, because as well as saying abandon hope, all you who enter, it also says this is the work of divine love and everlasting wisdom, or words to that effect. So immediately you're thinking, what's this about? And you might reach for your Hell 101 answer and say, it's the eternal judge, condemning people out of a sense of righteousness. But again, the minute you get in there, this starts to be challenged and broken down. And so I think, by the end of it, Dante realizes, the end of the Inferno anyway, Dante realizes that these guys are stuck because they're obsessed with the past, or paranoid about the future, or fixated on revenge, or there's something that's trapped them. And again, this immediately makes sense in terms of modern psychotherapy. Freud talked about the repetition compulsion, and that's a very accurate description of what's going on the floor of hell. But then you've also got the ontological aspect, because the more you get caught in the past and in acts of repetition, the further you risk falling from being. And so one of the great reveals in the Divine Comedy Inferno is that the floor of hell is not burning, it's icy cold. It's also on the edge of falling out of existence altogether, in this Platonic schema of the understanding of being. Now, in parenthesis, because it hasn't fallen out of existence altogether, I think also that also challenges the idea that Christianity teaches people go into everlasting pits of hell, because hell must still be within the divine, otherwise it wouldn't be at all. And so you've also got that whole universalist theme starting to emerge, even in the Inferno, when you really let it speak to you, when you really wrestle with it and try and see what's going on. And then, by the time you come to the Paradise, this is increasingly made explicit, where Dante starts to bumping into all sorts of people that he didn't expect to see, thought shouldn't be there, whether because of their notorious way of life, or because not only did they not know Jesus, but they lived thousands of years before Jesus even was born. And so, but the point is that comes after the Inferno and the Purgatorio, so you can really know it, not just be told it, and then have an argument about is Christianity universalist or not.
Yeah.
This is the way it works. You've got to go on the descent to make the ascent, would be another way of putting it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like Saint Isaac the Syrian, right? The fires of Gehenna are really the love of God. And that, I found that sense just sort of fully going, whole hog universalist, largely through, I had always sort of been like an ambiguous, hopeful universalist on the fence about everything. And then I read that all shall be saved, and I was like, yeah, like this is true, like I like playtime with that is over. But I've also,
I got it from the Divine Comedy, but because I read the Paradiso as well as just the Inferno. Again, in slightly a digression here, but it says so much about our times that people read the Inferno and then they think that's it. And they maybe can wrestle with the Purgatorio a bit because it sort of feels a bit therapeutic and all that. But it's very routine. You've had it this year with the 700th anniversary. People saying, "Oh, you can't make any sense of the Paradiso anymore," thinking that that's because it belongs to medieval superstition, when it's actually because we live in a time that has very little idea about the nature of reality. You could describe the three parts as in the Inferno, what Dante assumes gets undone. In the Purgatory, he gets remade to become capable of seeing things more clearly. And then in Paradise, it's only in Paradise he starts to see things truly clearly. And we're not interested in that. It really says a huge amount about our times.
Yeah. And this was going to be my question. Like, can we read Dante along universalist lines? And it seems the answer is clearly yes, right? All the way down to when Dante gets to the bottom layer of the Inferno, and there's a way out, right? There is a way out of hell.
And moreover, it's on the body of Lucifer.
Yeah.
The angel of light. They don't like see Lucifer and then Virgil goes, okay, look, we've seen all we need to see here. Now let's turn our backs. Off we go. They go onto the body of Lucifer, and it's on the body of Lucifer that things turn around. This is why it's genius. I don't think you can make that up.
No, not at all. And it reminds me of my friend Roberto de la Naval just published his translation of Sergius Bulgakov's various essays on death and the eschaton. And one of those that's been popular for a few years now is his talk about the salvation of Satan and the demons, right? And for Bulgakov, universalism does not finally happen until Satan himself has to repent and basically fix everything he has broken, right?
Wow.
Which is the final turnaround. Like, you know, the devil himself becomes the servus servorum Dei, right? Which is an incredible thought. Like it's an incredible thought, and in ordinary spiritual life, it's not always a useful thought. Particularly, you know, I'm thinking of like Callistus Ware's the admonishment he received when he had this thought for the first time, when his bishop looked at him and just said, "Mind your own business." You know,
right. I didn't know that. Yeah. The Bulgakov, I'm going to have to read some of him. I've never really read. I've only read about, and but there's been a conference on, actually, with people like Rowan Williams, John Milbank, Bentley Hart, and others talking. You can find it online, and
yes.
yeah, and it bringing together so much, not just robust philosophical theology, but also the esoteric and so on, which you were talking about earlier, as well as, you know, referencing these you know, speculations as well, which are incredibly rich.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, you know, sort of comparatively speaking, there are all kinds of, I mean, the easiest comparison that I can think of to Dante, actually, in Indian culture, would be at the end of the Mahabharata, right? Yudhishthira is invited to go to heaven, and when he gets there and he realizes that none of his brothers or their, like, you know, singular wife are there, he wonders where they are, and it turns out they're all in hell, right? Hindu hell is much more terrifying than Christian hell, actually. It's like there's like human fat like rotting on the walls and all this stuff. It's like horrible. But he like descends there and to see it, and the gods are like, "All right, you done? You want to come back?" And Yudhishthira says, "No, like I will stay here with them. I don't want heaven without them." And it's the minute that he says that it's revealed that actually they've been in, like, all of them are in heaven the whole time, right? And so that notion of paradise and hell being functions of perspective, right? They're functions of, to use Barfield's language, they're functions of in what state of reciprocal participation I am, right? Like, to what extent, how is my psyche, how is my inner life reflecting what is outside of me? Like, how am I cleaning my mirror, right?
No. I mean, you know, this is a bit glib, but there's some truth that you know, you see the hell of your own making. It's a bit glib because I think you need to see the hell of your own making in order to see through it. You know, and in Dante, that's wonderful about the Mahabharata. I think it makes sense for Dante, say, in terms of his engagement with Islam, because he's so deeply embedded to Islamic spiritual traditions, and you know, this stacks up in the scholarship. It's not just a speculation, and yet, you know, the prophet is found in hell, and it's very disturbing to read that. But it's when you realize that the Bolger they're in is the Bolger of the schismatics, who take things too literally. You know, the famous image from that Bolger is Bertrand de Born carrying his head like it's a light. He's seeing only by his own lights, literally. And so Dante is seeing his own literalism played out before him. And it's when he can see the full impact of that he can start to see more than just his literal perceptions of things as he'd assumed them to be. So yeah, this is these kind of mythical tales of inversion and so on. They carry profound truths about our perception and how it expands.
Yeah, well, and I find that, you know, since sort of fully identifying as universalist, I actually talk about hell more than I used to, right? Because, I mean, you know, for Origen at least, there was a great article about this in Church Life magazine run by Notre Dame, right? You know, for Origen, hell is like drinking the spicy cup of the Lord's wrath, and it makes you vomit up all of your evil, and you've got to deal with it, right? Like there are two paths to salvation. You can either start doing that now, or you can be forced to do it later.
And again, you know, the minute you start thinking about it and follow it through, this has got to make sense, because if you're a non-dualist, all of you is in God. So you've got to see it all. You can't just like, I don't want that bit to be here. It's there already. So yeah, precisely.
Yeah, absolutely. And so would you say, I'm conscious of time, and I know we need to wrap this up soon, but I really hope you'll do this again, because this was great.
No, thank you. I'd love to talk more. Yeah.
So just kind of as a final question on Dante, but also on psychotherapy, I mean, would you see the role of the psychotherapist as doing what Dante is doing literarily as the poet, and what Dante's various guides are doing, you know, Virgil, Beatrice, is that sort of the role of the psychotherapist, almost like a psychopomp, right? Because Virgil is effectively like, he's effectively Hermes, right? Guiding Dante down to and through the underworld. And Beatrice is much more like the Angelus Interpretans from apocalyptic literature, right? Is that what the psychotherapist does? Like, is the role of the psychologist to walk the person through this integration that Dante achieves by the end of the Paradiso?
I think it's possible. I mean, certainly the tradition that came out of Freud called psychosynthesis. I understand I think he's called Accidioli, the founder of psychosynthesis, who was one of Freud's contemporaries and companions. He said that the Divine Comedy is the model for modern psychosynthesis. I mean, for myself, I guess that well, maybe this is even mirrored in the Divine Comedy, that it's probably more likely that you'll have a psychotherapist who can take you through hell and up Mount Purgatory, but you may have to find someone else to lead you into paradise, a bit like Beatrice has to show up, because you know, for good and for ill, psychotherapy you know, involves trainings and professional. It's very professional, it becomes professional. And there's very good reasons for that. But it also means that to lead you into paradise, put it like this, you need someone who's established in paradise already. And a bit like you need the teacher that's established with the sense of awareness. And, you know, because the saints, the sage will transmit probably a lot more than they'll tell. And it's in their presence that this awareness in this sort of third stage can open up. So, you know, if you're lucky, you might have a psychotherapist who can lead you all the way, both down and up. But I mean, certainly in my own experience, you know, the Divine Comedy really came to life in my own psychotherapy because I had quite a traditional psychoanalysis, you know, many times a week, and it was great for the descent, and, you know, beginning to put things back together again. But as Freud himself said, you know, his only aspiration was to reduce neurotic unhappiness to ordinary unhappiness. You know, he wasn't interested in bliss, but I think we should be. And so it may well be that in practice you need more than just psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, but maybe not. You know, there are no doubt awakened psychotherapists out there as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to something Mackenzie said to me earlier in the week, that you know, she's a Jungian psychoanalyst. You know, Jung's psychology is very much one of psychic catabasis, right? It's very much one of the descent, less so than of the ascent, of the anabasis, right? And it does seem to me that, I mean, of course, like, you know, this is your basic Joseph Campbell hero's journey, right? You can't have the anabasis without the catabasis. And most of us are too afraid just to do that first part anyway, right? Like, yeah. I you know, to kind of wrap this back up with the first thing I said, I try to read my way into all of this because I don't want to deal with it, right? Like, I'd much rather just like,
look at me, I've got a whole string of degrees, you know.
Yeah. Same.
Yeah.
I mean, like, what is the point of getting, you know, a master's degree in religious studies and a master's degree in classics unless you're like afraid of dealing with yourself, right? There's no other reason to do this other than that.
I mean, just a thought on what you were just saying there. You know, the more positive side of it is that this is a way of addressing so-called spiritual bypassing, wanting the ascent without the descent, and how, so for me, they're complementary modes. And actually a sort of a little mark of the good teacher I will have is the good teacher who doesn't disparage psychotherapy, because they know that the descent can take quite as long as establishing the presence of awareness can, and requires it's its own domain. It requires its own ability and support and perceptions and so on too. So for me, the spiritual teacher who doesn't say, come to me and you'll have 3 years of psychotherapy in an hour, I'm already pretty wary then. I'm thinking, they probably don't fully understand the nature of descent and how it's part and parcel of this ascent. Whereas, the good spiritual teacher will quite happily refer people that come to them as to psychotherapy if they perceive that that's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, this was awesome. It's so good to meet you. I can tell that we will be great dialogue partners as time goes on. The book that you have coming out, just one more time for everybody, is Dante's Divine Comedy, A Guide for the Spiritual Journey. I will attach a link to its Amazon page in the description. And thanks again.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for all you're doing with all these conversations, because having just made the point that we've both got a string of degrees and what that might say about us, I think we also need the intellect alongside the experience, because, to use the Dante notion, for sure, love and desire and trouble draws us, but intellect discerns and establishes this understanding so that we can rise through the many heavens, not just, as it were, get a glimpse of the light. So, thanks for what you're doing as well, because it's a really important part of this moment as well, I'd say.
That means a ton to me. So it really does. God bless you. I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for now. Cheers.
Bye.